As I sit before my computer, trying to think of how I can tell my story, I know full well that no one will believe one word of it. I know I didn't accept it either when I first learned about what had happened to my father. Yet, the more I have pondered his story, the more I am convinced that it must be true. Still, I have struggled for a while on whether to let anyone else know. Even though I am pretty sure that his story will be dismissed out of hand, I wondered if it should be recorded. I finally came to a decision that, if for no other reason, it will be the only way my children to learn a little bit about their grandfather. I love my father and still miss him today, 7 years later. It began 9 years ago, but I will start with my visit to the bank for the purposes of this story. I was left cooling my heels in one of the bank offices by the bank manager. He was off having the bank's attorney confirm the court order declaring my father dead. While I waited, I pulled out and reread the note delivered to me a week ago, with a safe deposit. It was in my father's handwriting, but the piece of paper only had a bank's name written on it. Still, this was the only communication that I had had from my father in the last 7 years. The court order would grant me access to my father's box, a safe deposit box I never knew he had. I can't believe it's been 7 years since my dad disappeared. Some people think that he was murdered. Some are sure that he died of an accident, and they haven't found his body yet. Still, others feel strongly that my father ran away to escape his ex-wife. That's the most ridiculous of all the theories. My father loved his ex-wife with all his heart. I couldn't imagine him running away from her. But, in truth, I had no idea what had happened to my father. It was as though he had just vanished from the earth. I suppose I should introduce myself. My name is Jake Stanton, and my father's name is Mike. I'm here today in the bank because of 2 events that happened one day apart. A week and a day ago was the 7th anniversary of my father's disappearance. This meant that my father's estate could finally be probated. The second event, which happened the day after the 7th anniversary, a safe deposit key with a note from my father, was delivered to me. As I mentioned, he had rented a box at a bank that I had no idea he had ever used. It was 3 counties over. The reason for the delay in visiting the bank after receiving the safe deposit key was the necessity of providing proper documentation from the courts. Now, I'm sitting in some manager's office while they verify this documentation. I have to admit that I am beyond curious about what my father could have left in this mystery safe deposit box. I already know that my sister and I are the sole beneficiaries of our father's estate. It galls me that my sister, Tanya, is acting as co-trustee for my father's holding. She betrayed our father, and now she's making noises about forcing the sale of the ranch. I don't even know whether she can force the sale or not, but it has me worried. I have learned from my attorney that, once the IRS gets involved, the sale of the ranch will probably be forced. Even though this isn't Tanya's fault, I'm still annoyed with her. My sister and I have never really gotten along. To her, I was her stupid younger brother. She was 2 years older than me and treated me like I was retarded. Tanya was always making fun of me in front of her friends. When it finally sank through my thick skull that we're not going to be friends, I started getting revenge for all of her slights. There was a time when I was 9, and Tanya had her girlfriends over for a sleepover. She told them all that she'd seen me naked, and I had a tiny willy. All Saturday, they would call me Wee Willie, and hold their thumb and forefinger about a ½ inch apart. Then they'd laugh hysterically. I would turn bright red. Saturday night, the girls changed into their PJs and talked late into the night. When they finally fell asleep, I snuck into Tanya's room and sprinkled itching powder on their change of clothes. I also poured an extra dose on the clothes that my sister had laid out for the following day. The next morning, they ate breakfast and watched TV before getting dressed. They were planning on going to the mall and meeting up with some friends. They never made it out of the house as they began to itch uncontrollably. My mother was super pissed at me, but my father thought it was funny. The girls were ordered into the showers, and their clothes were washed twice. They were still itching when they went home. You would think that my sister would take that as a warning and leave me alone, but she never did. We went back and forth at each other, and I would learn that what they say about women is right. They are a lot more devious than men. Both my sister and my mother would prove that to me. My sister got a lot sneakier in her shots at me. Sometimes, I wouldn't catch on for a month or more. Me, I'm not a subtle kind of guy. One time, Tanya took my pet lizard and put it in Mom and Dad's bed. My mom had a cow, and I got punished because I hadn't secured the latch on my pet's cage. Actually, I thought it was my fault, at first. The cage's clasp was iffy and required a hard push to secure it. I probably never would have caught on except that I saw my sister smirking while I was getting yelled at. In retaliation, I dropped a cockroach down her back. I still smirk when I think about my sister screaming as she stripped her clothes off in the front yard to get rid of the insect. I got grounded for a week, but I smirked anytime my sister passed me. I really learned about how unbelievably devious women could be from my mother, how she treated my father. Toward the end of their marriage, put me off women for a long time. It wasn't until I met Jenny that I sort of trusted a woman, but even then, my fear of betrayal almost ruined my marriage. I loved Jenny with my whole heart and soul, and despite my fears, I asked her to marry me. She agreed without reservation, but the mistrust that my mother had instilled began to drive a wedge between my wife and me. Finally, in desperation, Jenny confronted me. "Jake," she told me one day, "we need to talk." My heart leaped up into my throat. I was sure this was the speech where I would find out that my wife had found someone else and wanted a divorce. At that moment, I was already preparing to hate her. "What exactly do we need to talk about?" I asked with a calmness that I can assure you I did not feel. "You are driving me crazy, checking up on me all the time," she said point blank. "If you can't trust me, then there is no future for our marriage." This accusation blindsided me. I thought I was so subtle that Jenny couldn't possibly know that I was checking up on her. But instantly, I knew that she was right. Our marriage hung in the balance. I also knew that I only had two ways to go. I could deny that I wasn't constantly checking up on her, or I could admit it and explain. Thank God, I chose the latter. "You're right," I said softly. "I'm messed up in the head. My mother cheated on my father, lied to him, and then left him to be with my father's worst enemy. You've seen my father. He's a broken man. Oh, he tries to hide it, but he is desperately unhappy." "Jake," Jenny said lovingly, "I'm not your mother. I would never cheat on you. But we need to find a way to put your fears behind you. Would you be willing to go to counseling with me?" The love I saw in Jenny's eyes right then dissolved probably half of my problems. I could clearly see the love and concern in my wife's eyes. I readily agreed to go to a therapist we knew from the hospital. Her name was Margaret Hogan. Jenny set everything up, and she was there at every session with me. Slowly, but surely, Margaret and Jenny worked me through my problems. I remember one visit where it all came together for me. The doctor asked me what my biggest fear was. I told her that I was terrified that Jenny would find someone better than me. I loved her so much that I didn't think I could live if that happened. "Jake, honey," Jenny said as she slipped from her chair and knelt beside me. She had tears streaming down her face. "If I ever lost you, my life would be over. I promise you that I will never leave you unless you tell me to go. But please, please, don't ever do that. I love you with everything I have." We hugged and cried for a good 5 minutes or more. After we composed ourselves, Margaret talked to us for another half hour. After that day, my fears began to quickly fade. I can't say that my trust is 100%. However, I will say this: I trust Jenny as much as any person can trust another. If I had to put a number on it, I'd say that my faith in Jenny runs to 99.9%. As I think about it, I know that I never really trusted my mother. There was always a kind of distance between us. Oh, I was pretty sure that she loved me. In fact, I was pretty sure that she loved both of her children. However, back then in my mind, her love for us came after her love for herself. Like I said, in her own strange way, our mother loved us, but Tanya was clearly her favorite. But that only put my sister 2 steps ahead of me, but still 3 steps behind our mother. It was totally messed up. The first time I ever witnessed my mother's selfish behavior was the day Tanya had the lead in a 4th grade play. Mom had forgotten about the show and scheduled a hairdressing appointment for the same time. Mom and Dad were going to the blue and white ball at the hospital. It was one of the top social events of the year. When my mother found out about the scheduling conflict, she opted to go to her hairdressing appointment. She could have changed the time, but that would have meant that her favorite hairdresser, Charles, wouldn't have been available. There was never a question in my mother's mind. She was going to her hairdressing appointment. I remember seeing my sister peek out through the side of the curtain, looking for Mom. Even though we never really got along that day, I felt sorry for Tanya. I saw the pain in my sister's eyes when she finally realized Mom wasn't coming. That was one of the very few heated arguments that I ever remembered my mother and father having. My mother just couldn't understand why anyone was upset. My dad was so pissed at her that he didn't talk to Mom for several days. Tanya didn't talk to Mom for a whole week. Anyway, my father could never stay mad at Mom, and my mother took Tanya out for a girls' day of lunch and shopping. No question in my mind, Mom was buying Tanya's love, and Tanya was totally taken in by it. I kept my mother at arm's length, but my relationship with my father was built on mutual love and respect. My father also had a special relationship with my sister. He treated her like a princess, but if Tanya had to choose, there was no doubt in my mind that she would pick our mother. Everything I know about ranching, I learned from my father, and through my father, I grew to love the ranch and everything about it. Like him, I started working almost as soon as I could walk. We were very, very close. The pain of him not being around is still with me today, 7 years after he disappeared. My mother crushed my father's soul and destroyed my relationship with her. I hadn't spoken to her for 2 years before my father went missing and not since. My split with my mother was such that I didn't invite her to my wedding, and I have refused to allow her to see her grandchildren. Jenny and I have 3 boys. I suppose it was inevitable that my mother would cheat my father. They came from completely different backgrounds. My father was born into a large family filled with love and mutual respect. My mother, Ashley Blakely, was an only child of a very successful builder, Jonathan Blakely, and his stay-at-home wife, Carol. My grandfather John and his wife, and started the ranch. It is now the cornerstone of my father's estate. My grandfather inherited the 100-acre parcel of land from his parents. My great-grandfather bought the property from a neighbor to help the neighbor out during the Depression, but the land had never been used. The ranch started with that 100 acres, 10 head of cattle, and 2 horses. My grandfather built their first house by himself. They lived in a dilapidated trailer until it was finished. Little by little, they built the ranch up, and when my father started running it, there was a little over 14,000 acres and slightly over 2,000 head of cattle. They also had 25 horses and assorted other farm animals. During their marriage, my grandparents had 6 kids: Sam, Karen, Bobby, Kelly, Heather, and my dad. It was a loving family where they all supported each other. It was known that if you picked on one of the Stanton kids, you had to face the other 5. As the years passed, all the kids eventually got married and moved away except for Heather and my dad. Then Heather was killed by a drunk driver when she was only 17. Even many years after her death, if my father talked about his sister, the tears would flow. They were very close. My father decided that he loved ranching and wanted to make a career out of it. This delighted both of my grandparents. My grandfather died of a heart attack a little over a year after my father graduated from high school. Even though my dad was still going to college, he started to take over running the ranch. At the same time, my grandmother began to teach my father about the other businesses also. My grandmother died almost 10 years after my dad got married. My grandfather was indeed a remarkable man. In addition to the ranch, he also built a feed store on another property fronting on one of the main roads. He then became half owner of the local drugstore. That's a long story that isn't important to what's going on now. Over the years, he acquired several other businesses that, again, have nothing to do with this story. To me, my dad was my hero. Oh, he wasn't a celebrity or someone rich or famous. He was just always there for me whenever I needed help, and he always seemed to know what I should do. I loved him as much as any boy could love his father, not so much my mother. However, I didn't start to hate my mother until she cheated on my dad and left him. I said that my dad wasn't a celebrity, and in the most real sense, he wasn't. But he was very well known for his athletic prowess. Oh, he wasn't good enough to be a professional athlete, but he was still pretty damn good. My father was the starting quarterback for the local high school, Clifton High, for 3 years. There is no doubt in my mind that this was the beginning of his ultimate marital problems. Clifton High School's football team was a collection of local ranch and farm boys. Their reputation was not built on finesse, but rather on brute strength. That was, of course, until my father was installed as the quarterback. He was 5 feet, 11 inches tall, and weighed 180 pounds. He didn't have a particularly strong arm, but he was quick and smart. Also, he practiced with his receivers at least an hour a day during the summer. By the time football practice started in the fall, my father and his receiving corps were already firing on all cylinders. If you know anything about elite professional quarterbacks, you know that they have to have a powerful throwing arm, be smart, tough, tall, and be highly accurate. I'm sure there are other attributes that I've missed, but these are right at the top of the list. Anyway, if you watch a professional football game closely, you'll notice that the quarterback often throws the ball before the receiver makes his cut. This was something my father did with great accuracy. From a professional football standpoint, my father was too short and his arm was too weak. But what my father had was more than enough for high school football. The two football powers in our county were Clifton High and Chester Academy. They didn't play each other during the regular season because they were members of different conferences. However, almost every year, they met in the playoffs. And the differences between the two teams and the two schools was like night and day. Clifton was just an ordinary high school, while Chester was a prep school for the wealthiest people in a 5-county area. As I mentioned, Clifton drew its players from the student body, and they were mostly kids whose parents farmed or ranched. Of course, the student body encompassed kids whose mothers and fathers worked the full spectrum of jobs. But the football team came mostly from the farms and ranches in the county. Chester, on the other hand, recruited players from the 5 surrounding counties. It was clearly evident that they also poached players from areas well outside. If Chester wanted a kid to play on their football team, the father mysteriously received a job locally. The family would then move to one of the surrounding towns. That's how Tucker Morris came to play for Chester. Tucker, or Tuck as he was known, had started as a freshman for a high school 300 miles away. He was such an exceptional athlete that he took that team to the playoffs for the first time in 10 years. Tuck also played offense and defense. He was the school's quarterback and the starting center linebacker. Being able to play on both sides of the line was unheard of. No doubt, that is why the officials at Chester took an interest in Tuck. As was the custom, Tuck's father got a job as a vice president in a local bank. And so, the rivalry between Tucker Morris and my father would soon start. The actual rivalry, or should I say, the hatred between the two started toward the end of the summer before they would face each other on the football field. Their first confrontation came one night when my father and some of his friends decided to get something to eat at Rosie's Burger and Dog. It was a local hangout for high school students. This particular night, several of the Chester football players had taken Tuck to Rosie's. As my father told me once, it was apparent that the Chester students had been drinking and were being loud and obnoxious. Tuck always was an arrogant prick, and he already decided that he could do what he wanted. That described the Chester students in general. They didn't think their shit stank. Anyway, Tuck was acting like a total pig. He was going from table to table, grabbing fries off someone else's plate, taking a drink out of another's Coke, grabbing someone's hat and throwing it across the room. My father probably wouldn't have done anything because Tuck was just making a fool out of himself. But then, Tuck decided to harass Becky Cummers. Becky was on a date with Simon Ballard. Simon wasn't a football player, but he was a friend of my father's. Simon was totally smitten with Becky, and she with him. Years later, after they graduated from college, they would be married and have 4 children. But tonight, Tuck decided he was going to lay hands on Becky. Remember, I mentioned all the attributes a professional quarterback has. Tuck had most of them. He was 6 feet 3, 200 pounds, and he had a cannon for an arm. Tuck was fast, but my father questioned his toughness. As quarterback, he had rarely been hit. And as a linebacker, Tuck was hitting running backs much smaller than him. My father also questioned Tuck's smarts. But, my father conceded, Tuck was probably smart enough on the football field. He was on track for a scholarship to a Division I college to play football, and there was a strong probability that he would make it to the pros. Simon, on the other hand, was maybe 5 feet 7 inches and all of 140 pounds. Becky was a charming girl and smart as a whip. Both Simon and Becky would get full academic scholarships to college. While Becky was not a raving beauty, she did have one significant attribute. She had big jugs. As Tuck was making his way around the room, he finally stopped at Simon and Becky's table. He stood there, leering at Becky, and then reached in with both his hands and squeezed Becky's dugs. She screamed, and Simon jumped up to defend her. There was no contest. Tuck put Simon on the floor with one punch. That was all my father needed to see. He was out of his seat before anyone knew it and slammed into Tuck. They both tumbled to the floor, and my father got 2 hard punches in on Tuck's face before the two were pulled apart. Needless to say, Tuck did not take well to his face being messed up. Thus, the feud between them started. It only got worse before school started. Tuck felt my father had taken an unfair advantage. So, in typical Tuck fashion, 3 days later, he challenged my father to a fight. Never one to back down, my father accepted and agreed to meet under the Highway 1 bridge. Word spread quickly and quietly amongst the students. At the appointed time, there were at least 200 kids gathered to watch the fight. Nobody thought my father stood a chance. Tuck was so much bigger, and he had a reputation as a brawler. The thing about Tuck was that he was a bully. He was so much bigger than most kids his age that he wasn't used to someone standing up to him. The fact that my father had infuriated him. He told all his friends that he was going to pound my father into the ground. Clearly, Tuck had no idea what my father was about. They circled each other as the crowd buzzed with excitement. They all expected blood to flow. However, there wasn't any blood. Tuck tried to overpower my father and kept throwing haymakers. None of them landed. My father kept dancing in and out, so Tuck tried throwing harder punches. However, the more punches he threw, the more tired he became. My father just continued to bob and weave, throwing a jab every so often. My father explained that, in a fight, patience is a crucial virtue. My dad waited for just the right moment, and then he stepped in when Tuck was off balance. He drove his right fist into Tuck's stomach as hard as he could. The blow forced all the air out of Tuck's lungs, and Tuck collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The fight was over. However, the hatred between the two had grown dramatically. Sometime during my father's sophomore year, he had discovered the girl of his dreams, and my future mom, Ashley Blakely. At the time, Ashley's father was a small but growing developer in the area. She had just transferred to the school at the beginning of my father's freshman year. However, they didn't meet until their sophomore year. Of course, my future mom was drawn to my dad because he was a star athlete and one of the most popular kinds in school. That football season, both Clifton and Chester went undefeated in the regular season. They met in the regionals finals where Chester prevailed 31-24. Tuck passed for 394 yards. Because Clifton lost, no one noticed that my father had thrown for 414 yards. No one seemed to say much either about the fact that Chester lost its next game and was eliminated from any chance of a state championship. My father was smitten with Ashley, and my future mother seemed taken with my father. Or at least, she appeared to be. Then they started dating exclusively. But when Clifton lost in the regionals, somehow Ashley met and started dating Tuck. The fact that Ashley broke up with my father for Tuck was a bitter pill for my dad to swallow. After that, my father's distaste for Tuck grew exponentially. What my father didn't understand was that his future wife was a totally self-centered bitch. Funny, even after everything that my mother did to my father, I'm not sure that he would ever agree with my description of his wife. However, in all fairness to my dad, most people didn't see this side of Ashley either. When I was young, I didn't understand the distance between us. As I grew older, I studied my mother and learned what she was all about. My mother was very clever in how she interacted with people. Somehow, she managed to make people believe that she cared about them. In truth, the way my mom worked it, she always subtlety brought the attention back to herself. She was so good at doing that people hardly ever noticed. My mother was the most socially conscious person I ever knew. I used to think that she was just fond of my father. However, years later I realized that my mother did love her husband on some level. She may have loved my father, but she always loved herself more. It didn't hurt that my father was a very well-respected and very well-to-do man who interacted in the proper social circles. The first two descriptions of my dad are entirely accurate. However, he only moved in those social circles reluctantly. Still, they included the people whose attention my mother craved. My father was not into the social swirl that my mother so loved, but he went along with it because he loved my mom. He did like to attend activities that he felt benefited the community, like the blue and white ball. Ashley was a beautiful girl, and then a beautiful woman. She had that stunning girl next door look with a sexiness that made men putty in her hands. While she was married to my dad, I had heard rumors of her having affairs. I never knew one way or another, and my father never spoke on the subject. However, if I had to guess, I'd say there was at least some truth to them. I had seen my mother work her wiles on my father to get what she wanted. I had no doubt she would use her sexuality with other men if she wanted something. If my mother had affairs, and I believe she did, it had to benefit her. She proved that during her high school years. Even though my father and Ashley were going steady, my future mom did find someone she thought was better, Tuck. This put her in a higher social circle, and as a result, she dumped my father to be with her new love. This first breakup hurt my dad, but he recovered. After the breakup, there was nothing for my dad to do but lick his wounds. He threw himself into his work at the ranch in preparation for the next football season. This left little time for my father to think about his former girlfriend. When the next football season rolled around, supporters of Chester and Clifton expected big things. As with the previous season, both schools went through their regular schedules undefeated. And as the playoff schedule had it, they met in the divisional finals. Once again, Chester came away with the victory 27-24. Tuck threw for 432 yards and won the game on a Hail Mary pass in the last minute. No one seems to recall that the defender slipped and fell down on that play. Nor did they remember that my dad threw for 404 yards and had taken his team from the 2-yard line down the field and scored and put Clifton ahead 24-20 with less than 4 minutes to go. Again, no one seemed to remember that with 1 minute and 17 seconds left, my father drove his team to Chester's 11-yard line. And on the last play of the game, my dad threw a perfect strike to his receiver at the 2-yard line. But as happens sometimes, the receiver started to run before he secured the ball. It fell incomplete. Now, there has been a debate for many years as to whether that receiver could have scored. When the ball hit the receiver's hands, there were 2 defenders just inside the goal line. I tend to think he would have scored, but I'm prejudiced. And one last thing, no one remembered that Chester, again, lost its next game. Since Ashley was still going to Clifton, my dad saw her almost every day during school hours. After the initial shock of their breakup, my father started dating other girls. Yet, he never found one that he felt as deeply about as he did about Ashley. My dad also decided that Ashley had the right to choose who she wanted to be with, so he would stick to being friends only. Nevertheless, my father's hatred of Tuck continued to grow. My father's senior year was the best of his 4 years at Clifton. He was not only voted captain of the football team, but also president of the student council. At the Halloween dance, my father and future mother were the king and queen of the festival. According to my dad, it galled the hell out of Tuck when he, the king and queen, take to the floor for the first dance. And of course, during that dance, my father held Ashley tight, and according to him, she didn't resist. The senior year football season, for my dad, was the highlight of his athletic career. It was also this game that led to the ultimate devastation later on in his life. I have thought about that year, and for my father's sake, I wish that things had turned out differently. That season progressed as every supporter of Clifton High hoped it would. Once again, Clifton pounded through the regular season undefeated. Chester did likewise, except that they crushed every opponent by at least 30 points. That year, the playoff schedule had been reshuffled once again. The playoff brackets laid out in such a way that both Chester and Clifton wound up facing each other for the state championship. One of the reasons that Chester was such a dominant team was that the coach had finally decided to use Tuck as a two-way player. You have to give Tuck credit on this. It had to be exhausting playing every down. My father always acknowledged that Tuck was a fabulous athlete. It was just that Tuck was a shitty person. The state championship game was a huge deal. Not only was the game going to be played in a stadium on the outskirts of the capital, but it was going to be televised throughout the state. By this time, Tuck had 20 or more scholarship offers. All the biggest and best football colleges wanted him. However, he had not committed to any of them. Rumor had it that he was waiting to see where Ashley was going to college to make his decision. I doubt that's true, but women love the romance of it all. From everything I've heard, Tuck was a selfish man who only thought about himself. That is except for when it came to Ashley. But even with that, I believe he would have eventually have selected the highest-rated college that offered him a scholarship. Wherever he decided to go, he was arrogant enough to expect that Ashley would wait for him. There was no doubt that he absolutely adored my mother, which made him perfect for her. He was a sports hero, his parents belonged to all the right clubs, and he seemed destined for greatness. Of all the great games my father played over his high school career, his best was this championship game. It was also the defining moment when the hatred between my father and Tuck was cast in concrete. The first half of the game was basically an offensive show. Between the two, Tuck and my father combined to put up 680 passing yards. There was virtually no ground game at all. For Clifton, this was due to the farm and ranch boys' rock hardness on the defensive line. For Chester, it was mostly on the strength of Tuck's middle linebacker play. Through the first half and most of the way through the third quarter, the college coaches must have been salivating at the prospect of Tuck playing for them. Even after everything that had passed between them, my father would always say that Tuck was the athlete with the best natural ability he had ever seen. All through the first 3 quarters, Tuck had punished my father every chance he got. This game was played before all the protections were put in to safeguard quarterbacks. So, every time Tuck blitzed, he would pile drive my father into the ground. But every time that happened, my dad would pop back up and smile at him. The smiles eventually began to annoy Tuck, and he started hitting my dad late. Most of those late hits produced no penalties. However, one rare one, that was called cost Chester. It was 4th and goal at the Chester 3-yard line, and Clifton decided to go for it. The score was knotted at 31-31 at the time. The Clifton coach had decided that a field goal wouldn't do it and called for a simple slant pass. But Chester had that covered, so my dad had to scramble. Finally, he found Randy Thompson in the far corner of the end zone. My father fired the ball hurriedly and was watching its flight when Tuck creamed him. My father admitted that he saw stars after that hit and got up slowly. When he was upright, he saw the flag on the field. Tuck had been flagged for unnecessary roughness. My father was delighted as his pass had sailed just a tad too high. At the 1-yard line, the Clifton coach called 3 straight running plays. Tuck filled the gap each time, and Clifton only managed to move the ball a half-yard. The third quarter ended before Clifton's coach had decided whether to go for it or not. With the whistle to start the fourth quarter, it quickly became apparent that Clifton was going for it. Like the previous 4th down play, the coach had called for a slant pass, only this time coming from the other side. However, like the other play, it was covered. After that, my dad was scrambling for his life with Tuck in hot pursuit. I must have watched the film of that one play 100 times. Tuck was closing in on my dad, and just when it looked like there was no way my father wasn't going to be sacked, he turned and ducked. Tuck's knee caught my father's helmet, and he went down in agony. Somehow, my father remained upright and scampered into the end zone. No one realized it at the time, but Tuck's knee colliding with my father's helmet had done considerable damage. As a result, Tuck sat out 2 plays and then went back into the game. But it was clear that he wasn't as mobile as he had been. After that last touchdown, the defenses stiffened, and the only scoring after that was a field goal by Chester. Still, with almost 9 minutes left in the game, neither team could play conservatively. So, the next time Clifton had the ball, my father was picking apart the Chester secondary. But then, one of his passes was tipped at the line of scrimmage and deflected into Tuck's hands. Tuck immediately took off down the field, and it looked like he had clear sailing. But my father was after him in a flash. An uninjured Tuck might have made it, but slowed by his bad knee, and the perfect angle my father had taken, there was a violent collision at the 20-yard line. My dad not only caught up to Tuck, but he nailed him. He launched himself into Tuck's legs, and as they fell, Tuck shattered his ankle and fumbled the ball. Clifton now had possession of the ball, and Tuck was out of the game. From then on, it wasn't a contest. Clifton scored once more, and the final score was 45-31. It was the first and only, to this date, state championship for Clifton. In true Chester Academy fashion, now that Tuck was of no use to them, his father was let go. This happened right after his son's graduation, so as not to raise any eyebrows. Of course, it did raise many eyebrows, but no one did anything about it. Tuck's father headed west and got another job in California. All of those colleges that were buzzing around Tuck dwindled down until there was only one. Northwestern was willing to give Tuck a try, but he had to start as a walk-on. If he made the team, he'd be given a full scholarship. Tuck rehabbed his knee and his ankle, but he was never able to recapture the ability he once had. He didn't make Northwestern's team. At that point, my father lost track of Tuck. Besides, Ashley had re-entered his life. Ashley had pretty much dumped Tuck a month after the state championship game. She was fed up with his sour mood and the fact that he couldn't do anything because of his injuries. It was a month or two after that before my father and her reconnected. They dated while my father completed his 2-year degree in animal husbandry at the local college. Ashley, on the other hand, went to the state university but quit in her first year. She had, for her whole life, been a big fish in a small pond. At the university, it was an ocean of students, and she was a minnow. Anyway, my mom and dad were married a month after he graduated. Ashley became pregnant shortly after that with my sister. I came along 2 years later. From what I understand, my father was extremely happy for the first 14 years he spent with his wife. I never knew from day to day what my mother's feelings were about the marriage. She blew hot and cold. Besides, as I already knew, it was all about her. What really kept the peace in the family was that my father did just about everything my mother wanted. Still, he would put his foot down when she pushed too hard. But then Tuck came back to town. Tuck's father, as I mentioned, went to California. Tuck's dad, initially, found a job with another bank but quickly switched over and became a stockbroker. He did exceptionally well at that and then transitioned over to a bank holding company. He rose through that group and then started his own holding company. He used what he had learned and the contacts he had made to begin acquiring banks in our state. When Tuck came back, he was working for his father. Tuck had been made an executive vice president, and he was in charge of the banks his father owned in the southern part of the state. That was 9 banks in total. For the first 18 months, nothing changed. My mother, however, would point out any time Tuck's picture was in the paper. Tuck, as I would later learn, desperately wanted to reconnect with my mother. Despite that, his father had him working 10 hours a day, restructuring the banks they had acquired. Once the banks were finally settled, Tuck began his seduction of my mother. It was not a long campaign. My father, the trusting soul that he was, didn't object when Tuck asked my mother to co-chair the blue and white ball. I learned later that my mother started sleeping with Tuck after the first week. They continued to sneak around because Tuck was also married. He had a beautiful wife and 2 children. My father was very trusting, but only to a point. He finally began to suspect, and even though it must have killed him inside, he hired a private investigator. It didn't take the investigator long to get the evidence. You would think that there would be blowback against Tuck and my mother, but there wasn't much. Of course, people felt bad for my father, but they didn't stop socializing with Ashley and Tuck. And as soon as my father shared the evidence with Tuck's wife, she divorced him. I assumed that it cost Tuck a lot of money to settle, but I never learned how much because the settlement was sealed by the court. She took the 2 kids and left the state. As near as I could learn, Tuck had very little to do with his children. He was a selfish pig. What I remember most vividly from that blow-up was the confrontation my father had with my mother. I can't get the image out of my mind, and I can almost quote the conversation word for word. My mother had picked us up from school, and when we arrived home, Dad was sitting at the dining room table. My father looked at Tanya and me and said, "Kids, go on upstairs. I need to talk to your mother." Tanya took one look at our father, and then our mother before racing up to her room. I pretended to go upstairs, but I snuck back down and hid at the bottom of the stairs. My father tossed some pictures in front of my mother. "How could you do it, Ashley? Does our marriage mean nothing to you?" My mother looked at the pictures and sighed. "I'm sorry you found out this way. Tuck wanted to wait until he could settle with his wife before I talked to you. But it seems that isn't going to happen. In answer to your question, I guess, our marriage meant something, but it's over now. It's time for both of us to move on. You've always known that I loved Tuck. Then why the hell did you marry me?" My father's voice was calm, but I could see the pain in his eyes even from where I was hiding. "I loved you, but I love Tuck more. Please, don't make this any more difficult than it has to be." My father sighed and shook his head. The devastation I saw in my father's eyes lit a fire in me. If I had been asked before this day if I loved my mother, I would have said, "Sure." And up until that moment, I did love her. However, the love I felt for her paled compared to the love I felt for my father. And at that precise moment, whatever love I had for my mother withered and died. Fine, I suppose we should talk about the details of your divorce. I heard my father say in a detached voice. I was surprised. I couldn't believe how calm he was about his wife's ultimate cheating. What is it that you want? My mother gave my father a look like he should already know. I want half. This is a no-fault state, and I'm entitled to half of everything, including the ranch. My father did something, at this point, that totally surprised me. He chuckled. Not going to happen, Ashley, he said calmly. You obviously have been taking your legal advice from Tuck. I looked it up online. Smart pig, my mother hissed. I'm entitled to half of everything. Oh, you're absolutely right. This is a no-fault state. My father smiled. And you're absolutely right that you're entitled to half of anything I own. The only problem with your research is that I don't own anything. The ranch, all the equipment, all the other businesses, all the cash are owned by a trust. All I get is a salary and a percentage of the profits assuming there are any. That was all set up after we were married by my mother. In case you hadn't figured it out over the years, she never liked you and was only civil because of me. Anyway, if you were hoping for a big payday, it isn't going to happen. I could see my mother's face go hard. Then a nasty smile appeared. Fine, if you want to be that way, the lawyers will handle it. Besides, Tuck is rich enough to take care of me without anything from you. I'll just take the kids and leave. I had remained hidden all this time, but my anger had been building as I watched my mother destroy my father. When she threatened to take Tanya and me, I lost it. I came boiling out of my hiding place. You bitch. I screamed at my mother as I came charging into the room. Jake, don't talk to your mother that way, my father said in total surprise. Neither of them had any idea that I had been listening to the entire thing. My mother was clearly more shocked than my father. Dad, I've always done what you've told me, I said with my voice shaking. But today, I'm going to have my say, and I don't care if you like it. My father was speechless as I turned on my mother. It was then that I saw the pictures of her having sex with Tuck. One of them was very graphic. I was disgusted. I called you a bitch, and I'm sorry, I said, lowering my voice and pointing at the pictures. You're not a bitch, you're a stray bitch. What's that disgusting stuff running down your leg? My mother recoiled as if someone had slapped her. She glanced at the pictures and then at me. My mother, at least, had the decency to look embarrassed. I was surprised to see tears begin to flow. Finally, she was able to shake free of her shock. Jake, honey, you need to go upstairs and let your father and me finish our discussion. This has nothing to do with you. I don't take orders from stray bitches, I said with pure hatred in my eyes. My mother's facade started to crumble slightly. As I think back on that moment, I realize it was the first time show any emotion toward me. Apparently, she did love me at some level, but now I didn't care. It never entered her mind that one of her children would object to anything she wanted to do. Now she was faced with the devastation she had caused her own son. I could see her pain, and I was glad. Mother, I have absolutely no respect for you, I raged on. In fact, I hate the sight of you, and the sooner you're gone, the better. I will never live with you, and that a-hole Tuck. I want you to know, as far as I'm concerned, my mother died today. Jake, you don't mean that, my father said as he put his hand on my shoulder. Jake, sweetheart, my mother said, deeply upset. Just because your father and I aren't going to be married anymore doesn't mean that I don't love you. I told you, I don't have a mother. The anger was still coursing through me. She died today. I pulled away from my father and started out of the room. Then I stopped and turned around. I am never going to talk to you again, and I don't ever want you to talk to me. We're done. I stalked out of the room and up the stairs. But as I went, I could hear my mother sobbing. I took a quick glance, and I could see my father with his hand on her shoulder. I'm sure he doesn't mean it, my father said, trying to console my mother. I'll talk to him tomorrow after he's had some time to cool off. My father did try to talk to me in the morning, but I wasn't interested in patching things up with my mom. I had said what I meant and meant what I said. In my mind, she had never been there for me, so it was no loss. And all these years later, I still haven't talked to her. The divorce went through, and my father's assessment was correct. My mother was entitled to damn little, but bitterness had filled my father concerning his ex-wife. What little my mother was entitled to, my father fought her for. Eventually, when the lawyer's bills began to exceed that, so my mother abandoned the fight. That was one of the very scarce happy days for my father. Tanya opted to live with my mother, and I stayed on the ranch. My father was not upset initially that my sister had decided to live with her mother. I guess he sort of expected it. But when she spoke against him at one of the divorce hearings, that all changed. After that day, my father never talked to Tanya or about her again. I don't think Tanya was ever really pleased living with Mom. Tanya never said anything uncomplimentary about her mother, but I know she was devastated that Dad had cut her off. The few times we talked, Tanya would ask me to have Dad call her. He never did. I knew that both Tanya and my dad were hurting, but I couldn't help either of them. This was more fallout caused by my mother's selfishness. When Tanya graduated from college after my dad disappeared, she stayed back east and got married. I wasn't invited to either event. I didn't understand why, and it pissed me off. I stopped talking to Tanya after that. I'm now in a disagreement with her over the ranch, and I'm afraid she's going to win. She wants to sell everything, and I don't. It's really complicated with the trust, no will, my aunts and uncles, and my father's disappearance. I've been running everything in my father's absence. About a week after I took over, I discovered that my father's brothers and sisters, some years back, had given him half of their shares. They all felt that since my father was doing all the work, he should get the lion's share. My father owned 60% of everything. With my father now being declared dead, the lawyers have told me that if I want to keep the ranch, my sister and I would have to raise a lot of money to pay the taxes. That is the main reason that my sister wants to sell everything. She and her husband don't have any money to pay the taxes, and they don't want to go into debt to try and save the ranch. The thing about my father's estate is that he didn't seem to have anything in place. This totally surprised me because he was a meticulous planner. Everything my father oversaw was carefully planned out. So, when I found out that there was no will, I was shocked. Now the state was going to step in and decide how everything would be dispersed. It was a mess. After the divorce, Tuck and my ex-mother married within a month. And true to Tuck's whole personality, he bought a large piece of land right across the road from the ranch, and he had a huge house built on it. Tuck did this so my father would see it every time he drove out the front gate. Once the divorce was final, my father retreated into his work as that was all that seemed to give him any pleasure. While I was still living with him at home, he would sit on the front porch for hours, just staring into space in the evenings. His heart was broken, and his soul had been crushed, and his hatred of Tucker Morris now consumed him. The worst part of it was that Tuck continued to rub it in my father's face every chance he got. There was no doubt that Tuck hated my father, and stealing his wife was the ultimate victory. Don't get me wrong, Tuck was head over heels in love with Ashley, but beating my dad made it all that much sweeter. Whether or not my ex-mother felt the same way about Tuck, I doubt. Tuck's taunting of my father got so bad that my father started limiting his trips to town. He began skipping all of the social functions. But still, Tuck wouldn't let up. The one thing that my father was still heavily involved with was the Cattlemen's Association. This was a special interest group to protect the rights of the cattlemen. My father had been chairman for 2 years and had been elected to his third and final term. You were only allowed to serve as chairman for 3 consecutive years. It was during this third year that Tuck joined the Cattlemen's Association. He was quickly elected to the board, so my father had to deal with him at every meeting. Tuck always brought Ashley with him to each board meeting. Of course, she didn't stay, but Tuck made sure that my father saw him give her a passionate kiss before her departure. My ex-mother was there to humiliate my father, and she seemed to enjoy doing that. Tuck and my mother were married for about 1.5 years when everything turned crazy. I didn't understand why my father was doing the things he was doing. I also couldn't understand my ex-mother's actions. It was as though the world had been turned inside out. Nothing made sense anymore. "Mr. Stanton," a voice intruded into my thoughts. I looked up and found the bank manager standing next to me. "We verified the court order, and I can take you to your father's safe deposit box now. I assume that you would like a private room to examine the contents?" "Yes, please," I answered as I got to my feet. The manager led me into the vault, where we collected the box and then into a private room. The room was only a little bigger than a broom closet, but it had a counter and a chair. Once the door closed, I locked it and put the box down. I opened it to find 2 large envelopes, and on top of them was a letter-sized one. I opened the smaller envelope first and found a handwritten letter from my father. I recognized his handwriting immediately. "Dear Jake, I am so sorry to have left you without a word. However, there was nothing I could do about that. Time was short, and you were out of town. Besides, it was best that you didn't know, as I feel sure you would have tried to stop me. My decision to leave was of my own free will, and I won't ever be returning." The 2 other envelopes in this box contain the complete story of what happened to me and my last will and testament. The will is notarized, and there is a business card for the law firm that prepared it. When you read my story, I know that your first instinct will be to think that I've lost my mind. But believe me, every word is the truth. When you read this, you can assume that I am alive, but please don't tell anyone, not even your wife. Where I have gone, no one will ever be able to find me. After you read my story, you'll understand why. In the course of my story, I have asked you to do a few things for me. I know they will be hard, but I'm begging you to please honor my requests. I can't truly atone for what I've done, but if you agree to do what I ask, I believe it will help relieve some of the sufferings I have caused. I am deeply ashamed by my actions. Do not worry about me. I am content and, God forgive me, happy about where I am going. My only regret is that I will never see you or your sister ever again. I always try to be a good father, but I know that I failed miserably. I disappeared. I want you to know that I was always so proud of you and loved you as much as any father could love his son. I also loved your sister with all my heart, despite everything. Even if you don't believe a word of my story, please do the small favors I've asked. That will mean so much to me. I have caused so much damage. I love you beyond words. Dad. I dropped my father's note on the counter and sat back in my chair. I was beyond shocked. My father was still alive. Where could he have gone? In today's world, no one can hide forever. But I had already spent a small fortune on private investigators trying to locate him with no success. I was puzzled and troubled by my father's remorse. What had he done that he wanted to make amends for? I ran back over the 2 years before my father disappeared, and I could have fixed no blame to him, despite the craziness that happened. So many emotions and thoughts filled me. Perhaps the overriding feeling was total happiness that my dad was still alive. At that point, I didn't believe for a second think that he couldn't be found. I would begin again by hiring the best private investigators money could buy. Only this time, I felt they had a real shot at locating him. It really bugged me that my father felt he had done some horrible thing. Again, I ran my mind over everything, especially the last half year before he disappeared.